Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to my talk this morning. I would first like to thank my mentors, Dr. Daphne Ledoux and Dr. Laura Mailloux, for helping me this summer, as well as NOAA and the National Science Foundation for funding this research. So this project that I've been working on this summer is actually a pilot for a larger project that has just been recently funded to start on September 1st, 2019 and last for 2 years. So Laura and Daphne went to Lee County, Alabama shortly after the March 3rd, 2019 EF4 tornado that struck that area, and they worked with a team of engineers to assess the structural performance of these damaged structures. They also interviewed direct survivors from the tornado path and wanted to know the precondition of their home and their experience before and after the tornado. And this is important because we are hoping to identify best sheltering options and identify the certain factors that contribute to coping and resilience after these disasters. So there are 3 worlds that this project kind of falls into, as you can see from these bubbles up here. And there are certain intersections within these worlds. So with engineering and meteorology, the EF scale standardization is one example of a project where engineering and meteorology comes together. For engineering and social science, NIST has published reports after the 2013 Moore tornado as well as the 2011 Joplin tornado, where they assess the structures damaged and also talk to survivors from those tornadoes. And for meteorology and social science, there is a plethora of studies related to just a few of these topics up here as well as others that fall into that intersection between meteorology and social science. And our project is kind of a combination of all 3 of these worlds. And the main driving factor for this is that nearly 70% of all tornado fatalities occur in mobile or manufactured homes. And this was especially true in Lee County, Alabama, where 23 people lost their life that day in mobile homes or manufactured homes. So you might be wondering if these survivor stories are accurate, and this brings up the topic of a flashbulb memory. So there are 2 different types of flashbulb memories. The first kind is a memory of a day that you might not have been directly impacted by a stressful, emotional or not personally experienced it, but you remember that day. So for 9/11, that is one of the first memories I have as a child. I remember going into my uncle's basement, and I wasn't in the World Trade Center, but I definitely remember that day. But there were people who were directly impacted, and they were in the World Trade Center, they were in the Pentagon. And so that would be this autobiographical memory that relates to our study. So these people who are in Lee County, they cannot forget these memories even if they want to, and over 80% of these experiences are accurate 4 to 5 months post-event. And so looking at Lee County, here is the 2 tornadoes that actually hit that area on March 3rd. The first one was an EF4 that is highlighted in red, and the second one was an EF2 that occurred shortly thereafter. And this is an example of the most damaged area in Lee County. So you can see EF4 damage indicators indicated by the red triangle. And all of those other triangles are damage indicators done by the National Weather Service. And those are damage indicators due to tree damage, power line damage, as well as home damage. And those pins that you see up there are where we have survivor stories from. So a blue pin represents where we had a direct interview, a yellow pin represents where we left a recruitment note, and a green pin represents where someone had secondhand information about the tornado. So Daphne and Laura traveled down for 2 different visits. The first was just 8 to 9 days after the tornado occurred, and they visited 9 households on the first day and 8 households on the second day and got interviews from those locations. On the second trip, they didn't get as many interviews. This is partially because there weren't as many people home as opposed to the first trip, because 8 to 9 days post-disaster, there were still a lot of people waiting for insurance companies to come, cleaning up their property and things like that. And so on the second trip, everyone was back at work, and they really just wanted to target the households that they missed. And so for these interviews, it was a semi-structured interview, so it started off with a main prompt where they just asked them to tell their story. And then we had certain follow-up prompts that we knew would be, or we thought would be important for our research. So the first 2 are very relevant for my specific research, so we wanted to know if they knew there was a chance of bad weather that day, or if they knew the tornado was happening. When did they know it was happening? Future research, we're hoping to look at what they saw, heard, and felt, and then if more than one person was present, how did they communicate to each other? And this is following Galea's interview process from 9/11 evacuees from the World Trade Center. And so I split up our home visits by beginning, middle, and end. This is not the whole tornado track. The tornado actually went into Georgia and carried on for several more miles. But for our interview locations, I found groups that I was able to group together by lead time as well as location. And with lead time, I calculated that based on looking at the time of the warning and matching that up with GR radar and doing my best to estimate it. And so what we have done so far is we have corrected and enhanced the transcriptions from the interviews. So we have denoted pauses and added emotions to these interviews. And our next step that we're going to do is following Reisman's model of a narrative analysis. So this enhances a transcription even more. So we're able to pull more information from those transcriptions. But for this presentation specifically, I am going to talk about the inductive thematic coding related to various communication modes done by the people in Lee County. So this is kind of a model of their description of their experience during the tornado. So anything from the chance of the tornado, days to hours beforehand, all the way up to their experience. And where I cut it off is that point when they decided to take shelter. And so I looked at all of those orange bubbles. Those were my main codes for going through these transcriptions. So if there was a television on, if a person told them to take shelter, if a phone went off, if there was noise, things like that. So this is kind of a lot, but I want to draw your eyes to certain parts of this table. So you can see the main ideas that I coded for at the top with the different interview locations, so beginning, middle, and end, and then the two people that were actually in the second tornado at the very end of this graph. So for the noise column, you can see 18 out of the 27 people described hearing a noise that they thought was the tornado before seeking shelter. As well as the saw column. Many people, they said they didn't see what looked like a tornado, but they looked outside and they didn't like what they saw. And so that was their action to go and take shelter. And another thing you can see from this graph is that out of all of the interview locations we have, there are only two people who only had one mode of communication, as opposed to everyone else who pretty much had 3, 4, even 5 modes that got them to seek shelter. And so another way of looking at this is this graph right here. So basically I took the messaging modes that I coded for, so their phone going off, a person alerting them, weather radio, siren, things like that. And that is in the blue column. And then the saw, heard, and felt at the end of that table is gray. And so you can see a steady increase as you move along in the tornado path with the receiving messages. So more and more people receive more messages about the tornado before they took shelter, and less people saw, heard, and felt the tornado. They mostly saw, heard, and felt the tornado when they were already in their safe place, whereas opposed to the beginning when multiple people saw, heard, and felt the tornado before they took shelter. So to kind of put you guys in the survivor's shoes, I've made a timeline of people from the beginning, middle, and end of the path that are representative of the whole group. And so this is an example for someone in the beginning of the path who had an estimated lead time of 8 minutes. So she received a phone alert, looked outside, heard a noise, and that's when she took shelter. And she took her son with her. So that was 3 different things that prompted her to take shelter. For the middle of the path, this person had 4 different ways that prompted her to seek shelter. So the first one was her son summoning her home from church because she was staying late that day. And then her son was looking at radar and didn't like what he saw. Her husband looked outside, again, didn't like what he saw. And then they heard the noise, and then they took shelter. And lastly, for the end of the path, this person actually knew that there was a chance of tornadoes a couple days beforehand, and she states that normally they get EF1, weak tornadoes, things like that. And then she got multiple phone alerts from multiple apps She was watching TV the whole time, and they didn't actually seek shelter until friends from all across Alabama were texting asking if they were okay. And that is when she decided that they should go to shelter. And this person had an estimated lead time from the original tornado warning of 16 minutes. So again, I estimated that looking at radar and looking at the warnings that were issued. They also would have received or possibly received a PDS tornado warning and a tornado emergency as well. And so this point that she makes about the EF1 tornadoes or weak tornadoes that they were used to getting in this part of Lee County was a trend among many interviews and something I hope to look for more in future research, but this is what I've come up with so far. So I looked for recent memory from 2013 to 2018 at the different ratings of tornadoes that Lee County specifically has received. And as you can see, they only had one EF3 tornado. Everything else was EF1 or EF0. And that EF3 occurred back in 2014. And it actually didn't cross paths with any of the interviewees that we have from this study. So most of them were not directly impacted by that tornado. And then looking at the second graph, that goes all the way back to 1962 with Lee County highlighted. And you can see in that again, compared to other counties, they didn't have as many or as strong tornadoes. So for future data collection, we've been thinking about different follow-up prompts that we can ask our survivors. So we want to know all of the pieces that went into their decision. And we also want to see the notification on their phone if they still have it up, if they haven't cleared their notifications. Another thing we're looking at is if it's too soon or too late to go to these tornado paths. So we don't want to go too late because people lose their willingness to talk to us. However, we do want to stay within, we don't want to go more than 4 to 5 months post that flashbulb memory time frame that has been proven in research. And we also don't want to go too soon because we don't want to interfere with search and rescue. However, for the engineering part of this study, it's very important that they get in there as soon as possible before things get moved around and things like that. And so in conclusion, these are my 3 main findings that I've found so far. 24 out of 27 interviewees received more than one communication mode. At the end of the surveyed area, they received more of those alert type communication modes. And even so, 23 out of 27 experienced seeing, hearing, or feeling the tornado throughout the whole path. And with that, I will take any questions that you have. Yes. They were all in mobile or manufactured homes, yes. Oh, yes, there was 1 or 2 frame homes, yeah. Yes.
So based on the multi-communication, which one would you say was the most effective to get people to actually take shelter before they saw or see them, or saw or felt something?
So most people described getting a phone alert or watching the TV. For the television, people described losing power, and so they often knew that there was a tornado, but they didn't know where it was at that point because their power went out. So I would say probably a phone. Yes.
I'm actually from around it.
Yeah.
So saying that we don't experience that much of intense tornadoes, do you think that since this event happened, the people that you talked to, do you think they would take shelter immediately regarding the F scale of the tornado?
Yeah, I think it'll vary. Oh, yes. So he asked if, because they went through this experience, if they would be more likely to take shelter because this tornado was so strong. So there were people who at the end of their interviews with us, they did mention that now they're going to really pay attention to the weather and they're going to take everything seriously and things like that. I definitely would be interested in maybe surveying people later on and seeing how their kind of risk perception, things like that, how they would react if there was another tornado. But people did mention that they definitely would take it seriously now. Yes.
Did you see any differences between the first round of surveys versus the second round of surveys?
Yes. So the difference between the first round of surveys and the second round of surveys, the first round of surveys, people definitely it was fresh in their memory. It had just happened 8 or 9 days ago. And so they definitely were tended to be, a little more in depth, whereas with the second round of surveys, just something I kind of noticed was a lot of times people had to think through their thoughts to kind of piece together, like, oh, I was watching this station. No, I was watching this station. So just because it was 2 to 3 months after that tornado, but that was really the main thing that I realized.
All right, at this time, we're going to wrap up the first section here.